Welcome to our Bridge City News Canada Day special. We hope you've had a great day celebrating our country. Tonight, we want to pause and take a look at Canada, where we are and where we're going. There's been no end of controversial issues and challenges facing our nation, and Canadians are watching more closely than ever how our leaders are dealing with those challenges. Here to discuss that is David Leis. He is the president of the Frontier Centre for Public Policy and also the host of Leaders on the Frontier, seen regularly here on Miracle Channel. David, welcome back. Happy Canada Day.
Well, great to see you and happy Canada Day.
Thank you. Okay, David, I'll start by giving you a little promo here. So some of what we want to talk about tonight is in the latest episode of Leaders on the Frontier, which is the state of our nation. So you talked a lot about citizenship and what it means in 2026. So we'll get to that, but let's start with public policy. So of all the legislation that we've seen getting shoved through the House of Commons in this latest session, which bill concerns you the most?
Well, there's kind of a family of a cluster, if you will, of bills that are concerning. I think the easy one is Bill C9 in terms of being concerned really about censorship and being kind of criminalizing, um, I think, what is referred to as, well-intended speech. I mean, in this country, we don't all have to think alike, and it's healthy to have discussion and debate and I think many analysts are very concerned that Bill C9 in particular will criminalize those who have good faith intentions to talk about more traditional values. And in this country, we need to be able to have that debate and discussion to arrive at truth. And that's important to our tradition of freedom.
And well, with the Bill C9, we've heard a lot about our freedoms, in particular religious freedoms, obviously. So a lot of Canadians sent messages to Ottawa expressing their concerns about the removal of the good faith religious exemption. So has the time come for Canadians to speak louder and maybe less polite?
hmm Well, I'm not sure if it's less polite, but it's more vital than ever that citizens speak up and be able to exercise their democratic rights. I think for too long, there have been many Canadians that have taken those democratic rights for granted. Um, it's easy to be silent or get caught up in other activities and not really pay attention. And I think what we have here is an opportunity for citizens to be involved because I think that you have a set of leaders among a certain class. I refer to them commonly, Jeanette, as the good and the great, those who kind of think they know better than other citizens what is best for them. So they'll use the excuse of, well, this is for your own good, or this is to protect us from hate, when in fact we already have laws against hate. Um, and I think that what we have going on here is a kind of a change in the philosophy of some in our leadership class in many of our institutions who really believe that rights and freedoms, instead of being naturally born to each and every one of us, are emanate from the state. And I think that's radically different than the tradition that Canada comes out of, namely a 1,000-year history from the Anglo-Saxon tradition. So I think people need to pay attention and not take for granted that the state is really holding your back when it comes to empowering you with those rights and freedoms.
Hmm. David, let's touch on citizenship for a moment. On your latest episode of Leaders on the Frontier, you had an expert panel discussing the meaning and importance of citizenship. And one of your panelists shared that fewer people are wanting to become citizens. So, how surprised were you to hear that?
Well, I was surprised, yes and no. And I don't want to sound indeterminate, but the reality is that it's a bit confusing in the sense that Canada has, on one hand, a lot of persons who want to get into this country. Many of them are temporary workers or in other classes where they're not permanent residents. And so those people reside in our country, and there's a record number of them. In fact, some 9%, if memory serves me correctly now. And so that's changing the feel and composition of our country. We want not just simply people that are are present here, but people who are have a kind of a pathway to citizenship, who care about our country. And that means that they're not just paper citizens. They're citizens who are all in and prepared to undertake not only, claim their rights and freedoms, but also their responsibilities. Because otherwise, we have the phenomenon where we have all kinds of people getting the benefits like healthcare, education. I mean, there's so many of them, but they're kind of strangers. They're not really integrating necessarily in the country. And I think everyone is concerned about that. Immigration is important, but it needs to be managed well.
Right. David, on your show there, you pulled out a citizenship guide, which talks not only about a person's rights, but also their responsibilities. And one of your panelists responded saying a lot of Canadians are what he calls lazy
Mm.
citizens. And, I guess voter turnout might be a good indicator of that.
Mhm. Yeah, no, I think that's true. I think it's a healthy challenge to all of us to ask, are we also undertaking our responsibilities as citizens? And there's a number of them, like obeying the law, to taking responsibility for oneself, to be self-sufficient to yourself and your family. Serving on a jury is an obvious one. Voting is the other one that you just mentioned. And so many Canadians don't vote. And this is not to be taken for granted, especially in the context of many people who made the ultimate sacrifice as citizens out of a love for their country. They served and even were killed. So we need to take those rights seriously. In many nations, they don't have them. So what we have in Canada is precious. So on Canada Day, my hope today is that we remember those responsibilities, not just our rights.
Good point. David, you love talking about the policies that shape our nation. So, how do we
Mhm.
get more people to engage?
It's a great question. I think there's so many. I mean, one of them is obvious. We need to teach civics in our schools. We need to teach people that citizenship is foundational to our democracy. And it's citizens that build a country. It's not the state per se. The state is there to serve the citizens. And sometimes we're putting this all upside down. We're either being silent about it, we're not talking about it, and that is a huge problem. So this is where we get into concerns about ideology being in our schools, where we, instead of talking about those traditional rights and freedoms, we're talking about group identity and group rights instead of the common unity that we have together as citizens of Canada. And that should be the paramount, primary allegiance, because that's what makes a nation. And a nation is in the benefit of all of us to be able to um, work together in community, to create all kinds of civic clubs, to be able to build all kinds of institutions that build on that heritage. And that's an inheritance that we've received, over many years, and we can't take that for granted.
Yeah, speaking of national unity, I guess, we certainly have a lot of separatist sentiments brewing here in southern Alberta and throughout Alberta. So, as you travel the country, David, how is this being viewed? And is it a good or a bad thing to have these types of frank discussions in a democracy?
Well, I think at this current time, it's understandable that there are many in this country that want to pursue, including in Alberta, sovereignty outside of the federal system. And it's because there's a lot of frustration around some very obvious points. And I think it behooves the federal government and all Canadians to listen carefully to what those concerns are. Like, the concern about the war on our primary industry, namely oil and gas in this country, or the lack of proper representation through elected persons in office. I mean, you've got ridings in Alberta, as an example, that are much larger than so many other provinces. That needs to be rebalanced. Or the whole equalization program, where all kinds of money is sent from largely Western Canada to the rest of the country, when we know that the equalization formula is simply not fair because it doesn't include hydro production. So you have a lot of opportunities that, if they were changed, I have no doubt that that would change the concern and the momentum of the efforts to separate from Canada. And I think that makes sense if we listen to each other better. especially over this Canada Day, that will happen. So in my travels, I hear mixed things. I hear people say, oh, well, people are just whining again. Well, no, we need to listen carefully to what those concerns are and not just simply listen, but we need to act.
Right. And we used to talk about national pride and unity
Mhm.
and that idea of everyone rowing in the same direction, our so called or shared values, rather. So, now we have talk of separation and political silos, stoking division and differing ideologies. So much is different now. So, how do we navigate this and continue to be a nation that has historically been viewed as a stable and compassionate democracy?
Well, great question. We need to be mindful of those kinds of traditional principles that have enabled Canada to be so successful. Think of it, that people could come from all over the world and settle this, frankly, inhospitable part of North America. It's fairly cold, and to be able to introduce a fairly prosperous nation with, industrialization and civilization, to be able to work with people from, Aboriginal communities to people from all over the world to build the Canadian dream. So we need to celebrate that and recognize that history. um, I mean, it is incredible the history that we have in this country that has really built it over the last 200 years in particular. Um, so I'm very proud and grateful for that as a Canadian. At the same time, we can do better. We can build on, for example, the principles of our Constitution. And too often, the federal government has interfered with the provincial jurisdiction, and that has complicated things. And I think that's where we need to do the basics well. We don't even have interprovincial free trade among provinces. That's worth at least, 5, 7% of our gross domestic product. I mean, so we're in some ways our own worst enemies as a country. And so we need to kind of renew the vision and with commitment and grit, be able to pursue that so that we make a more prosperous nation, but also one that really believes in unity rather than being taken down, I think, very destructive pathways of ideology that emphasizes group rights over the individual rights and freedoms of Canadians. So for me, this is a time for renewal and building again.
Interesting. How are our schools doing? It's been a while since I've been in school, but in terms of them teaching history, teaching civics, teaching
Mhm.
about that civic responsibilities, do you think more needs to be done there?
Absolutely. In fact, when we look at the opportunity in schools, it's tremendous to teach those civic lessons, to be able to, give people a citizenship test. In fact, you can go on the Frontier website and you can do our citizenship test. In fact, we put it out there as a way to encourage people to ask yourself, how well do you know our history and our principles and identities? So I encourage people to do that. And I think the onus is on every citizen to do it, because if we don't, we are really failing ultimately to realize the full potential of our country, and that is that citizens really provide the hope and opportunity to move this country forward. They need to speak up, they need to exercise their responsibilities, they need to serve each other in, say, volunteer capacities. We need to have a heart for our country more than ever.
David, thanks so much for sharing your thoughts today on this Canada Day.
My pleasure.
David Leis is the president of the Frontier Center for Public Policy and also the host of Leaders on the Frontier, seen regularly here on Miracle Channel. Coming up on our Canada Day special, a sociology professor from Wilfrid Laurier University will share his concerns about the values shaping our country.